Hello everyone, welcome to the ATAR Notes lecture for creating text and writing about protest. My name is Sunny. I'm really excited to be delivering this lecture to you all today. Hope that you find it really useful given the changes and the new study design, and it helps you to navigate the framework a little bit better and get some writing ideas as well. So on this slide, you can see some of the free resources that ATAR Notes has to offer if you need some additional study supports. And let's get right into the lecture. So I'll begin by introducing myself. My name is Sunny. I completed VCE in 2021 with an ATAR of 96.70. I received a study score of 44 in English, as well as I did all three English subjects. So I completed literature and English language as well. And I'm currently in the last year of my degree, which is a Bachelor of Paramedicine at Monash University. So you can follow along on the bottom bar as well. As you can see, we'll first be looking at the framework of protest and examining some of the ideas that you might choose to explore in your creative writing. Then we'll be looking at all four of the assigned four mentor texts by Vika from the study design and having a chat about how they incorporate context, audience, and purpose, which needs to be also very clearly incorporated in your creative writing to do well, and how they can inspire your own authorial decisions, all the textual features, and we'll also review an exemplar piece responding to the framework, have a chat about how to write the reflective commentary, and look at an example of that as well. So, writing about protest, there are some quotes to prompt us to start thinking about protest, definitions of protest. Protest can be something said or done that shows disagreement with or disapproval of something. So, don't think this framework boxes you in to always have to write about group protest and physical protest. Protest can be in the form of an internalized disagreement with something. And it doesn't mean that any action needs to be expressed or taken to physically protest. Another definition, it's a formal expression or declaration of objection or disapproval, often in opposition to something which one is powerless to prevent or avoid. So this is more about that physical protest. And then the last definition touches on social movements, where a sufficiently large number of people cooperate by showing up, undertaking the costs and potential risks of doing so. So again, that physical protest, group protest. So when writing about protests, we need to understand the common thread that you need to write about protest in the form of a show of dissent, of anger, potentially even despair. It's usually born out of passion and driven by determination. It can be in response to anything. It can be a response to personal, social, legal, political, international issues. But it should always be interlaced with some kind of hope for change. So the framework, Vika wants you to explore this conflict, the idea of protest, through a lens of hope, the hope for the resolution of a conflict. So all protests have that shared purpose of seeking some kind of change and resolution, and in that way, demonstrating hope. So it's essentially when hope meets determination and determination meets action. So to write about protest means exploring the perspectives of those that are disenfranchised and find yourself intertwined with those who are often voiceless. You don't have to write from the perspective of someone physically engaging in an act of protest, but you need to be able to understand and empathize with their points of view in order to craft effective pieces with a framework. So there are lots of historical facts that can help inspire your writing, and if you do find interest in some historical protests, famous figures that protested, even individuals that engage in a form of protest completely on their own without a group backing them, this is optional. You can write about protest through the lens of modern issues and internalize protest as well, just disagreement with a certain idea, so you don't have to box yourself in. And the framework, once you explore the sometimes beautiful, sometimes tragic, and sometimes harrowing stories behind protest and beyond protest, the feelings and ideas behind protesting. So the aim is for you to be able to say and feel something about protest and express that in your writing. Now, some specific ideas we can write about, writing about protest and its underlying tragedy is one. So, the precursor to many of protests is often some kind of tragic pivotal event or a series of events that influence many people. Some examples: Invasion Day rallies in Australia, they acknowledge the genocide and ethnic cleansing of First Nations people. Likewise, another recent movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, is something you can write about, and it's sparked by police shootings of unarmed black citizens. Um, and the aspect of tragedy in protest doesn't necessarily correlate to sadness and disappointment, but it can involve attempts to reclaim power through acknowledgement or mourning. And the idea behind this concept is that a tragedy is not the end, but instead some kind of beginning. Protesters don't want people to feel sorry for them, they want change. So, again, that link to hope is being noted here. So, you can explore protest through the lens of tragedy or tragedies preceding the event and hope for a better future. You can also write about succeeding or failing in protest. Some questions to prompt you. What is a failed protest? What is a successful one? Is that even a thing? Um, and is a successful protest one that brings about massive, tangible change? That doesn't make any sense because we'd have to class the civil rights movement as a failure if that was the case, because the same issues exist today. So instead, is it about discussion in society? Is it about a successful protest bringing about change slowly and instilling changes in the way that people think and feel about certain issues? So, this element of the framework is very largely interpretive. And if you're writing a piece about this, succeeding or failing in protest, you don't even need to give a singular answer or resolution to the question. You can just explore this concept. So, you could also think about the concept of a successful protest as well. How can we judge if a protest is successful? Is it through the public perceptions of it, or is through actual change occurring? What change do you expect would occur through the type of protest that you've chosen? Additionally, you can explore outcomes of protest. So, what are the expectations when we protest? Are we expecting a resolution that matches our own perspective of what that outcome should be? And some questions to prompt you to write. And you can write about the personal understandings of protest. So think about the figureheads of protest, the leaders, the people that incite change. Um, do they think about their testimonies? That's an aspect that you can explore, right? A figurehead's testimony about the protest. Why do they write and communicate these testimonies? What are they trying to do? If a protest is also fundamentally personal and intrinsic to those figureheads, those leaders, likely that's going to make the audience feel the same powerful emotions as we would if the protest directly concerned us as well. Now, you can also write about the value of protest. So that would give you a very clear message or purpose to your piece. So, can we place value on protesting as a phenomenon itself? And how's protest going to be perceived by all the stakeholders that are targeted through the protest? There will be a variety of views, right? So if change is expected to be brought about, whoever is expected, such as the government or an institution, to bring about change in response to protests, they'll likely be unhappy due to the fact that protest is happening, right? What about the different perspectives of all the stakeholders? That's something to explore. And that's a good thing to note for if you want to write in a persuasive style, write a persuasive piece, a speech, for instance. So, as an example, the school strike for climate protest, the figurehead and leader was Greta Thunberg, and she was propelled into the public spotlight, and climate change action was pushed to the forefront of people's minds and really quickly gained traction. This was really effective. and an audience among politicians and world leaders as well. She was successful at getting. So, in this way, if we were to define the value of protest as to what kind of response it gets by its audience, by the people it targets, then this had really, really significant value. But the tangible changes are very little. So, the COP26 summit ended up being a failure, and there were no further developments on climate policies made as a result of this meeting. So, is that a failed protest, or is it the value of protest about effectively reaching its audience and changing people's minds, putting ideas in their head, changing perspectives? So you can also write about different forms of protest, and you can split it into writing about violent or peaceful forms of protest. So these are some very specific examples on this infographic that hopefully you find useful. Ideas like activism, a vigil, non-violent, and then violent like riots, terrorism, insurrection. So that would be good to research. And there will be overlap about with some forms. So demonstrations, for instance, can turn violent or can be peaceful. They can have elements of both. Okay, now we'll jump into examining our mentor texts. The first one that we'll have a look at is Friday Essay on the Sydney Mardi Gras March of 1978 by Mark Gillespie. This is from 2016. Mark Gillespie is an academic specializing in English and anthropology at the University of Sydney. The text type is a feature article, and it was targeting online readers of the conversation, as well as the LGBTQIA community. The purpose of the offer was to reflect on the author's experiences with the 78ers, explaining the realities of life as a gay man in the 1970s and expressing his hopes for the future. So we see the links to protests in terms of this links into LGBTQIA rights and perspectives and attitudes towards them. Similarly, when you write, you need to have a clear audience, purpose, and context outlined. As we can already see from this piece has all of those elements. And there will be language and textual features that target specific audience, reflect the context and the purpose throughout the piece. And this is an expectation that when you write, you do the same thing. You've put a lot of thought into planning these three elements, and all of the language and structure and language devices that you've put in your pieces is effectively targeting your audience, reflecting your context, and reflecting your purpose throughout your piece. This is crucial to scoring mid-range to high marks for this area of study and will be crucial for the exam going forward. So this is why we need to closely analyze our mentor texts and see how they have done this so that you can effectively practice doing this as well, rather than writing vague pieces that maybe have some kind of clear message, even a complex message embedded within, but there's nothing clearly targeting any audience and there's nothing clearly reflecting any context. And a context can be modern times, but there, with protest, there needs to be some kind of issue. What is the issue? What is the reason for protest in your pieces? So let's have a look at the text. First, having a look at how it embeds context. So in 2015, Christine Foster, she was a lesbian local councillor in Sydney, called for a public apology on behalf of LGBTQIA people who were attacked by police at the 1978 Mardi Gras. And this text represents a key milestone in the ongoing struggle for gender and sexual equality. Gillespie examines the issue by recounting his own experience as a young gay man in Sydney who also attended this Mardi Gras parade in solidarity with other activists. So a very physical form of protest, whilst foreshadowing the structural discrimination that exists. He explores the issue from his perspective, but also examines the broader social and political ramifications. So we see some quotes that show the text as well. We were sick and tired of being criminalized, pathologized, demonized, of being made to hide who we were, and having our rights to live as human beings denied. Clear links to protest and what they are protesting about. I would like to think that despite the provocation on that night itself and the centuries of violence that had been perpetrated upon us, we as a collective knew instinctively that violence was one of our main grievances, and we had a mission to resist it and fight against violence using other means. And that clearly embeds his message, his purpose in relation to protest, that it's a means to resist unfair intrusion upon their human rights and fighting against violence using other means, using peaceful means, to incite change, that hopefulness of the collective, the protesters. Okay. So let's explore in more detail the purpose and the links to protest. So even though Gillespie acknowledges that society made huge strides in moving past these harmful politics, he maintains in this modern context that the struggle is not over. And he cites an example from the 2013 Mardi Gras, which is much more recent, much more in the future, in which 18-year-old Jamie Jackson Reed was arrested and assaulted by police. The article is primarily reflective and explanatory rather than persuasive, so the author doesn't dwell or seek to galvanize his audience, but he logically outlines the importance for an authentic police engagement with minority groups where honesty and respect replaces suspicion and contempt, and necessary change in attitude and cooperation, as well as the necessity of remembering history and making sure we do not lose memories of our earlier struggles. So this article, we can see that target audience, it's really targeting to and trying to be resonant with young members of the LGBTQIA community that are unaware of the history or the fight for equality in Australia, but also to draw their attention to the fact that this is an ongoing issue and potentially that can be relatable as well if people have had those experience also of overt and covert discrimination. The piece ends with a call for a living apology, which he defines as one that affirms the need for ongoing vigilance, continuous monitoring, that these experiences never happen again. His cautionary language is rooted in his personal experiences, having witnessed the violent consequences of unchecked discrimination. So, this strengthens his purpose through these textual features and also the structure of the article as he recounts the history of the 78ers before he offers readers that stark reminder that their human rights need to continuously be protected. And as we said, they're monitored, the words that he used, monitored. So, how could you use a piece like this as an inspiration for your own creative writing? Here are some ideas. You could write your own explanatory article, not a persuasive, but an explanatory article. So, just like him, how he doesn't really take a stand or attack certain groups, rather aims to inform and be unbiased in the issue. You could adopt the persona of someone reflecting on their past experiences as a protester or a revolutionary and how they feel about it and what kind of lessons they have for readers in a contemporary context. You could write a point of view narrative, imagining that you are in a protest that turns violent, just like this protest, and you could potentially shift perspectives between the protesters and the police to make it even more interesting. You could also write a series of letters in the aftermath of a protest movement and consider how a person's emotional response might change over time. All right, our next mentor text is Freedom or Death by Emmeline Pankhurst. Um, she's the head of the suffragette movement in Britain in 1913, so this is set much more in the past. And suffragette, that's all about the female rights movements, okay? And her audience was the attendees at the Pankhurst rally in Connecticut, where she delivered this speech, though more broadly, women in America in general that she's hoping to inspire, and men in power whose views she hoped to challenge. Her purpose was to argue that the militant tactics of the suffragettes are justified and express her rationale and experiences campaigning for women's rights. Very clear links to protest, clear audience that will be targeted. Again, I won't mention that again, but that was a very important note that I made when we looked at, before we looked at the first mentor text, that if you take anything from this lecture is that you need to closely plan those elements and incorporate them throughout your piece. Um, so this speech remains a powerful symbol to this day of the women's struggle for equality and political rights. And we said she was the head of the movement in Britain for the female rights. Her speech opens with a clarification of her purpose immediately. So Pankhurst declares she's not merely an advocate of reform, seeking to take away attention from America's own suffragettes, but she also introduces herself as a soldier who has temporarily left the field of battle and a dangerous convict, even though she's aware she doesn't look like either of those things. There's a powerful and captivating opening in treating her audience to want to hear more from her unique perspective in the issue. So, the links to protest and more expressions of her purpose. There were explicit links being made between the quest for suffragettes and similar revolutionary movements internationally and movements for female rights. She highlights so that was a really good incorporation of context that's seen in the piece as well. She highlights the cognitive dissonance in men recognizing the plight of other men seeking equal rights, but not women. And she dismantles that and shows how that's wrong. She also draws on, this is highly persuasive, on potential rebuttals and dismantles them entirely, such as about suffrage not being necessary because women are so well off that they have nothing to complain about or no reason to make their voice heard. And she's very logical in all of this. She's not emotional. She aims to be very persuasive. She's very methodical and patient with her language and patiently deconstructs these arguments to challenge any of the preconceptions held by her audience. She also clearly signposts her speech as she reminds the crowd of her intentions and priorities as well. The speech explores the history and the practicality of militant methods in the context of protesting for equality. She underscores how there was no other recourse for her or other women seeking change, saying that it's a necessity to make the situation in the country so urgent and so pressing that it has become politically dangerous for the government to neglect that question any longer. So, taking really extreme action as a necessity. Clear links to protest. Pankhurst also argues that men take their right to vote for granted, and so militant attacks on their material possessions force them to confront the issue, making things uncomfortable for them until voting rights were granted for women. So we see a really good quote here. We have, first of all, to convince you that we are human beings. And I hope to be able to do that in the course of the evening before I sit down. But before doing that, I want to put a few political arguments before you. Not arguments for the suffrage, because I said when I opened, I didn't mean to do that, but arguments for the adoption of militant methods in order to win political rights. We see it's highly formal, we see it's clearly signposted throughout, and there's some really impactful language here. First of all, to convince you we are human beings, and I hope to be able to do that. So it really highlights how bad and unfair the situation is and makes that emotional appeal. How could you use freedom or death as a mentor text? So you could write a speech that poses a similar ultimatum, showing extreme form of protest and forcing government to do something. So you could take inspiration from that. She declares that in their fight against inequality, either women are to be killed or women are to have the vote, showing how extreme these forms of protest were, where they're leaving no other choice because the situation is so grave. Okay, and you could mirror this kind of absolute language and the way that she logically dismantles arguments without getting emotional or getting seeming irrational about the situation, and that determination that's present in the speech. You could write a piece reflecting on the over 100 years of feminist and gender equality protests that have happened since this speech. And, you could use her as inspiration to see how she laid the groundwork for future progress. Or it could be in the form of, persuasive or informative styles of writing, such as through opinion pieces or an article that explores the history of all of this. And Pankhurst's speech also draws clear dividing lines between those who advocate for suffrage alongside her and those who remained silent and complicit. As inspiration, you could um, explore the divide between remaining silent about an issue that you personally care about, versus those who take action, and what divides these two groups, and why is it important to take action for something you believe in. Our next text is a short story, Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut, and he's an American novelist. This is set sometime in the past, but that's not relevant. 1961. It's actually a very futuristic, it's a dystopian story. And I feel like this is really fun to think about. You can write protest protest in the form of issues well into the future. So you can imagine how bad climate change would get in the future. And you could write something like a short story that creates a futuristic world. Um, or, from the perspective of a character that's personally dissatisfied with the situation, but can't do anything to change it. Like similar to the style of George Orwell and his novels, creating a dystopia where there's internalized dissatisfaction with the current state of things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that something happens, something is done about it. Or the protest can be entirely personal, the forms of protest. So I really liked this short story when I read it. I thought it was really interesting. Um, and yeah, it gives you that extra inspiration. Oh, I can write about things from a futuristic perspective, how bad climate change, how bad natural disasters, urbanization have gotten. It's specifically targeting readers interested in ideas of dystopia, perfection, and conformity. And the purpose is to explain and explore a dystopian future, arguing that readers should be cautious about the implications of protest. So, this text is set in U.S. in 2081, and Harrison Bergeron tells of the tragic tale of the Bergeron family as they adjust to living in a handicapped world. So characters are purposefully handicapped to essentially so the government can keep everyone under control. It's a system of governance in which everyone is supposed to be equal to an extreme and absurd extent. So, some people might be born or develop disabilities throughout their life, but because everyone is handicapped, everyone is equally, yeah, handicapped, and that doesn't exist in this society. There's no such thing as everyone is essentially living with extreme extents of disability that's forced upon them, in a nutshell. Um, and this elusive Moon Glampers is the United States Handicapper General. The text portrays something like um, an exaggerated version of what would happen to the world if all characteristics that distinguish people were taken away from them. And that's what the protest revolves around. The story follows Hazel and George Bergeron, whose brilliant, strong, and handsome son Harrison was arrested due to his abnormal tendencies. So the wife, Hazel, she's got average intelligence. She doesn't even need a mental handicap radio. It's also implied that she's not very strong and is probably of average beauty. George, the husband, on the other hand, is implied to be physically capable and of above average intelligence. So that's why he has several bags of birdshot tied to him. You can see in the picture here to disable him and counteract his strength, and a radio in his ear to, the mental handicap radio. At the start of the story, their teenage son Harrison has been arrested, but neither Hazel nor George appear to think much about it and express little emotion regarding his arrest, which is very, very strange. And he will be the protester in this text. So it's a clear divide between his parents who see what's happening and realize what's happening, and they don't care about the consequences to him for protesting, and Harrison, who's taking action, but he suffers as a result because as an individual, he isn't able to enact much change. So George and Hazel watch a television show together, And there's ballerinas dancing a dance that doesn't seem to be very good because all of them are handicapped. George entertains the notion that dancers shouldn't be handicapped so that they could dance more gracefully, but he's interrupted by a noise in his ear. His mental handicap radio. And he notices this affects some of the dancers on screen too, because they must have had a similar thought that it's not fair that they're handicapped. George appears weighed down by this latest development in his head and relents to the weight of the birdshot around his neck. Hazel suggests that they cut a hole in his bag and they let some of the birdshot fall out to make it easier for him to not have so much of a weight. And she can do this because she doesn't have a mental handicap radio, but George refuses, reminding her of the penalty and citing the fact that he's doing it will begin a chain reaction in which other people might think that they can get away with doing the same, and they will be back to the so-called dark ages in which everyone was competitive. So their view of when things were normal in society is very wrong, and that's the view that's been instilled in their minds by this society that they live in. Suddenly, the TV shakes, and the actual Harrison Bergeron is on screen, their son, that was arrested. In front of all the crew, he declares himself to be the emperor and the greatest ruler to have ever lived. He tears off his mental and physical handicaps and asks for a ballerina to stand and become his empress. Then he dances with a ballerina, appearing to leap higher with every step and dance a lot better than the ballerinas before. They even attempt to kiss the ceiling and succeed prior to kissing each other. So you can see this is a really, really bizarre story. And then Diana Moon Glampers and her cronies come in with a shotgun and shoot Harrison and the ballerina and threaten the musicians to put their handicaps back on. That's when the Bergeron's TV burns out and cuts the footage. So Hazel, the wife, turns to George, who's just gone to get a beer. When he returns, he briefly muses that the wife appears to have been crying and asks why. But she says that she does remember, bookending that story with her vague confusion and emotional detachment. Then a sound chimes in George's ear, and the story ends with George congratulating his wife for forgetting the sad thing. So you can see how easily they've just forgotten their son who has now died. There's a lot to break down analytically with this text. Essentially, the message about protest here is very dreary and sad. It portrays the ineffectiveness of protest because it shows Bergeron's brush with activism and how swiftly and brutally it was shut down, resulted in his death. So his death represents all protesters and activists in a society that prizes conformity over uniqueness and individual expression. This is too much to take on for one person. So it says that those in power will always be able to skew people's minds and create stigma surrounding protest and even actively persecute people who take part in protest because society will accept this as as wrong, which is what governments want people to think. So Bergeron is a symbol of protest who fails to achieve change, but instead marks only a dent in the far stronger machine of what is an oppressive society. And this text signifies that it's quite impossible to change anything in a highly oppressive society. So it's a gloomy message about protest. Some ideas how to use this as a mentor text. You could write about performance as a form of protest, which was seen in this text. Dance was explored here, so it's not a physical protest like the way you'd imagine it. You could write another dystopian imaginative piece, explore dynamics of power between the powerful and the powerless. You could write a piece also eliciting a similar message to Harrison Bergeron because it's definitely not a standard type of message. Usually people write about protest as a means of inspiration and change and hope. And I mentioned 1984 by George Orwell. These are some potential really great texts that have the idea of protest is a bit more subtle or it's purely individual. And this is really interesting to look at to get more ideas about writing this as well, writing about this framework. Okay, our last mentor text is the monologue from City of Gold by Wyatt, and this is published in 21, modern text, and is in the form of a monologue. It's an extract from Wyatt's play City of Gold. There was specific viewers of ABC's Q&A, specifically white audiences who downplay or overlook the feelings and struggles of First Nations people. And her purpose was to express personal frustration with racist attitudes in Australia towards First Nations people. So clear links to protest there, different issue. Again, there's a lot of thought about context that has gone into this piece. As we've seen with all of our mentor texts, it was surrounding the death of George Floyd on the 26th of May 2020 in the US. And this is a black man that was murdered by a white police officer. Other officers stood by and did nothing, even as he was yelling, "I can't breathe," and people were filming this incident. This is what sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. So this is in response to that. So Wyatt's monologue was delivered 2 weeks after this event, um, as the Black Lives Matter movement was surfacing. And Wyatt takes the stage to contextualize this struggle from his perspective as a First Nations man, from a different perspective. But even the very first line is a rejection of his tendency to use race. He says, "I'm always going to be your black friend, aren't I?" He also highlights the implicit prejudice in labeling people like him an Indigenous actor, while reserving the adjective less label of actor just for white people. So he's implying that this is really wrong, that being white is the norm, whilst everything else is an aberration, and that he even has to be referred to as an Indigenous actor. So we see that this monologue is about personal forms of protest, and in that way it brings another something different to the other mentor texts as well. Like all of these texts are quite different. So the hope from Vika is that every student can find something that they like and get some ideas from. So he calls out the industry and the societal prejudices that result in him being typecast as the angry one, the tracker, the drinker, the thief, and he vilifies that idea of being a token used to tick diversity boxes. One of the most obvious language features that he uses throughout his speech is first person I and second person you pronouns to make it personal. So he fearlessly addresses you as his target audience. So he makes impactful statements like, "You do benefit from it," in reference to having white skin. He calls about also upon many of his personal experiences, so he uses anecdotes to convey the reality that I mess up, I'm done, in order to contrast those unfair expectations of him as a black man, not him not being white. At the emotional crescendo of his monologue, he expresses that when he is tired of taking it, he will occasionally, on a bad day when I don't feel like taking it, I'll give you that angry black you've been asking for. And there's so much ferocity when he delivers this line in his speech that we can see this is his personal form of protest. And we're made to, as the audience, to understand that this rage is a product of being discriminated against for so long and feeling quite hopeless about the situation. He ends with some imperative sentences and commands. This needs to stop. Never trade your authenticity for approval. Offend your family. Call them out. And he ends with this impactful declaration: silence is violence. We see this close link to protest here. Okay. So a bit more here, but importantly, want to touch on the fact that we said this text is acting as a personal form of protest, and it's ultimately aiming to be a wide reaching for Australian society and confronting examination of racism that still prevails in Australian society. And it reminds of the power of performance because this is a speech as also a form of protest. So ideas on how to use this as a mentor text: you could write your own monologue that conveys and expresses anger And even if you don't like the creative or imaginative forms of writing, this is something that's great to experiment with because a monologue is, it's not like those forms of writing, like writing a short story, because you don't have to create setting descriptions. It's just about like a stream of consciousness, laying all your thoughts and feelings on the paper. You could also write an investigating piece, exploring the psychology of tolerating injustice, and this could also be in the form of something like a persuasive article. You could write a speech or a letter that's intended to shock an audience into action. So, just like this speech aims to do. So, imagine that you are desperate to bring about a change, but the only weapons that you have are your words. So, how can you confront your audience? Take inspiration from some of the language that Wyatt has used in his monologue and some of those techniques. All right. So now that we've looked at all of our mentor texts, we'll have a look at an exemplar piece and the reflective commentary as well. So this example is a personal recount. Let's have a read through. Let's think about what the audience, context, purpose of this piece is and how they link to the framework of protest. So there are gunshots in the distance. It's ceremonial, but I still flinch. A rock hurtles towards a nearby shop window and creates a strange, spidery web of cracks that immediately begin to mirror my face by the hundreds as I stare into its surface. My grandfather pulls me into a nearby shop as a guttural, high pitched trumpeting cuts through the air and replaces the suburban buzz that had settled on the town square. I sit in my grandfather's lap as he asks for a cool glass of water from the hairdresser we had managed to convince to give us shelter from the sweltering heat and the fanfare of the outside world. They chat idly together as I throw nervous glances over my shoulder, as rows of people in traditional regalia beat drums and blow on trumpets, cascading flashes of gold, blue, and orange, with the dark green camouflage fatigues of the military, ironically unconcealed in this solemn affair. So we can see that this is set against the backdrop of protest and disarray within the country, right? But ironically, we start to see that although the protagonist, the unnamed protagonist, we're assuming it's like a kid because he's referring to his grandfather. Okay, he is really concerned by the fact that this is happening. He feels really unsafe in this setting, but um, interestingly, there is a high level of indifference demonstrated by his grandfather, just accepting these circumstances, and also people. We see this great description was made here. Rows of people in traditional regalia, juxtaposed with the cascade, just juxtaposed with the dark green camouflage fatigues of the military, unconcealed. Um, so we see protest and disarray and potential danger as well. I tug at my grandfather's sleeve, and he looks at me, slightly annoyed that his animated conversation had to come to a premature end, and asks me what is wrong. I find myself unable to vocalize it. The unmistakable feeling of fear settles in my stomach, and I look away ashamed. Why do I feel scared? It's only a parade. It's only a triumph, a celebration of victory. I look again at the spectacle outside. Notice some of the vocabulary that is being used to refer to this. It's a parade. It's a spectacle. This time I notice people, not in uniform, walking, getting on with their day. A child skips alongside her mother. The trills of reverberating gunshots don't register to her doll-like ears. I think that she must be humming to herself, the way her lips contort and press together with the sighs of practice. Another young boy rides a rusted, barely functioning bicycle, straining to maneuver its pedals and gritting his teeth in the process. He rides to catch up to an older friend, who laughs at him with mirth that I could not fathom, and they both race their rickety toys towards the end of the square. This high level of indifference, that the fact that this is just accepted by the public and the people not involved, is shocking to this young protagonist. The fact that this is acceptable in their community. I won't read this long paragraph because we don't benefit just from me reading things out loud. So have a pause and read through. I just want to touch on the ending. I reach out to see where the rock may have landed, but I miss my opportunity. It disappears into the distance, as does she, pursued by too many angry men to outrun. No one else follows her with their eyes. So this is a bit similar to the mentor text we looked at with the short story, the Harrison Bergeron, because there is such an indifferent attitude demonstrated by the public to protest, an indifferent attitude to, this woman launched a rock and the military men, too many angry men to outrun. The fact that she's going to suffer for protesting and potentially die for protesting and no one cares. So this is the sad side of the tragedy of protest. It's no change occurs and personal consequences for protesting as well. Okay, so have a full read of the piece if you want. It's quite longer. That's why I don't want to read the whole thing out loud and waste our time on this session. And now we'll have a quick chat about the reflective commentary. As you can see, it's worth 20 out of 100 marks dedicated for all of your unit free SACs and contributing to your study score. And crafting text is worth 60 out of 100 of your unit free SAC marks contributing to your study score. So quite significant, more than text response. Now, instead of talking about it in a vague way, a reflective commentary, I'll explain it in a super easy way, really easy to write. It's a short piece. Usually it's like 400, max maybe 500 words that students write. And it's almost like an analyzing argument essay of your own writing and authorial decisions. So you literally quote things from your own piece. You write this in first person as well. You still write it in formal language, but in first person. You quote some of the language features and vocabulary that you've used intentionally, and you analyze those choices in relation to the intended effect that you were trying to get on your hopefully very specific audience, bringing it back to context, but most importantly, analyzing in terms of, most frequently, how it connects to the framework of protest, the things that you've done. Okay, so you also need to clearly state those elements like your audience, purpose, context, your language, the text type that you've chosen, what your piece is about, genre if relevant, essentially all the main things. Some of the things that you may cover: vocabulary, text structure, language features. How have you abided by the genre conventions writing a specific text type? Because research and thought needs to go into this too. You don't just write without thinking how, if I'm writing a feature article, there should be multiple subheadings in my piece and some kind of chronological progression and persuasive language techniques. So you need to put thought into everything that you do. And there are marks for abiding by your chosen genre conventions as well. And it's on VCA's exam rubric. Views and values, that's essentially your purpose, your message. And remember, this needs to be interlinked with your framework. So this needs to be essentially what you're trying to say about protest. And themes and big ideas. You have a lot of options. You don't have a high word count, so you need to plan for this and be really selective with which things you want to analyze. I've just broken this down in more detail, some of the things that you can explore. And this changes based on what's relevant to your piece. So have a look at the questions that are intended to prompt you. The expectation is that you reflect on and share the implications of your authorial choices in your writing. And if you've intentionally used your mentor text, you would reflect on that as well. But that's optional. So you need to explicitly state your purpose, like outline it at least in a couple of sentences somewhere in your reflective commentary, and link this to textual evidence from your writing. So again, you'll be quoting some of your language choices, anything additional that is relevant. Did you incorporate a certain tone? Did you choose first person, second person, first person, third person with a certain intent behind it? Did you write a non-linear narrative using things like flashbacks or switching between different timelines, and why? You decide. If it is a structural feature, you do need to quote it and name it though, and there is an expectation that there will be quotes in your reflective commentary. You need to explain and comment on vocabulary, text structures, and language features, conventions, and ideas used in your own writing. This is all directly from Vika as well. So examine your authorial intent, same as argument analysis, bring it back to intended effect on your audience, or bring it back to links with your framework. So you shouldn't be analyzing things. You shouldn't be analyzing anything without linking it to your audience or your framework of protest. Okay, and that this is like something that makes it a lot easier. If you like to have a structure for things, you can just remember this FLAPC abbreviation. It includes every, some of all of the key things that need to be in your piece, okay? And essentially in order, because you could put all of this in one paragraph. So you would start with form. Your first sentence would be outlining um, the text type in which you have written, if relevant, any genre as well, stating the title of your piece and what it is about. And if it's in relation, and because context needs to be an element, this is also the bit where you have to introduce the context of your piece. So is there a certain social issue that your piece is about? Or is it set in the future or modern times? You have to state that here where form is. So you'll begin your piece that way. Then you go into language. So you will state some of the main language choices that you've used. So imagine you're writing in an imaginative style, like short story. You might say that you adopted mostly pervading your piece are things like imagery and metaphors. And then you'll say why have you used them? What effect were you trying to overall create through your main language choices? And if that's a persuasive piece of writing, instead you will state the main persuasive language techniques that you have employed. And what were you trying to do through them? Then you outline your, as specific as possible, target audience and why are you targeting them exactly. Then your purpose, your message in relation to the framework. And if you haven't done context back up in form, you can move it down and do it as your last sentences. I like to have context tied together with form. I think that flows more nicely. And if you follow this structure, you will just have an additional, paragraph or two that go into quoting from your piece, talking about those language choices and analyzing them. Because this serves like an introduction. It doesn't analyze quotes from your piece and the structural features. This FLAPC structure is kind of like an introductory paragraph that incorporates some of the main things that you do have to mention. And then you need more quoting, analyzing, bring it back to the framework. You don't need a conclusion for a reflective commentary, but you could end on restating in your final sentence your purpose or your message again. So if you want to follow a specific structure, this is really effective, and this does everything it needs to do with a reflective commentary. So we said you must use first person in your reflective commentary because you are the author, and there are some sentence frames to help you. You do need to remember that you are writing in a formal style. So make sure your writing reflects that you're writing in a formal style. Just because you're using first person, it doesn't mean that you can be informal. So watch your vocab. So this example of a reflective commentary is in relation to the exemplar personal recount that we just looked at. Let's have a look. In this piece, I have attempted to portray a scene from my childhood in which protest was prevalent and was witnessed through a child's eyes but recounted in hindsight. So we see it's kind of following our FLAPC a little bit, not exactly. This is still really nice because the first thing you need to do is introduce the text type. This introduces that this is a personal recount and what your piece is about and how it links to protest. So all of those things were done here against the backdrop of the imminently ending Sri Lankan civil war. Context has been introduced. I have depicted the farcical pantomime of normalcy that individuals who live in urban areas seem to live. So more information about the piece and what it's about. This farce is portrayed in my juxtaposition between domestic, suburban scenes of children with the defined protest of the woman who disapproves of the spectacle that the soldiers are creating. So it's analyzing juxtaposition, so a language feature that was incorporated. And I talked about this indifference that was depicted as we were reading the piece. The disharmony is further cemented through the symbolic depiction of victory and the idea of victory to be one that is as light and as empty as confetti. We see quoting has been done and naming any structural features, and then and then more. We also see analysis, generational dissonance to the horrors of war. So it's trying to link to protest a little bit, which is portrayed through the character of my grandfather. You can analyze characters too if you've intentionally placed characters in your pieces and created them in a certain way. So it's all about relevancy with your reflective commentary. Who seems keener on adult conversation than on the spectacle? Nice and short quotes from the piece and analyzing the language. Although he undoubtedly sees what I see, including the lone protest of the woman, he pays no mind to it and carries on with his conversation. Likewise, none of the adults in the scene appear to be particularly keen on the disruption outside, but no one acknowledges or attempts to stop it. So we see everything is being analyzed, bringing back to ideas of protest. And then it's ending with the purpose of the piece being stated. Ultimately, through this recount, I have portrayed the idea that protest can be willfully ignored for the benefit of normalcy in modern society, despite the dangers of such ignorance. So clearly outline that purpose. And if you want to do well in this task, you must come up with a complex purpose. It can't be something super basic, a basic, simple message. And it needs to be nicely outlined in your reflective commentary as well. Okay, you have to put a lot of thought into how you phrase it and how you say it, because your teacher could have a more simple idea of what your message is with your piece, and this is why you write the reflective commentary. You can explain that you had, you know, instead of having your assessor just interpret what they think you were trying to do, you can tell them and then they can see what you were trying to effectively do through a piece. So that's why, they won't mark your actual piece and your reflective commentary separately. They would try to look at them together. And it's an aid to better understand your writing. That's why it's more important to your marks than just the 20 out of 100 of the SAC marks, because it needs to be read alongside your SAC. And this is where you can try to show off that you really put in effort to make your piece complex. And yeah, so hopefully this example helps as well. You've got a really structured approach that you can use that I've outlined, or you can write kind of freely as long as you remember to tick off all of those flap C elements and analyze some of your authorial choices, like this example. Thank you everyone for coming along to the lecture, and I hope that you found this really helpful, and best of luck for the rest of the year with English.